In the weeks after her hospital visit, Lydia found herself replaying that Tuesday morning over and over, as if by understanding it more deeply, she could change something. She remembered the exact angle of the sunlight falling across her kitchen table, the faint scratch of her pen on the paper, and the sudden tremor in her fingers. The doctor at the hospital had told her she was lucky, that what she experienced was a transient ischemic attack, a warning stroke. The words stayed with her, heavier than she expected. A warning, she thought. A warning for what? Her daughter, Claire, insisted on staying with her for a few days after she was discharged. Claire brought groceries, reorganized the pantry, and fussed over Lydia's meals. She also left small, sticky notes around the apartment, bright yellow reminders to drink water, to take her medication, to rest. At first, Lydia found them a little overbearing, but she soon realized she'd started following them without thinking. She was drinking more, resting more, and most surprisingly, feeling calmer. One afternoon, while Claire was out running errands, Lydia picked up her old photo album. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers brushing the faces of friends and students she hadn't seen in years. It struck her that so many of them had been taken for granted. Those smiles, those conversations. The thought made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from a sense of urgency. She had always told herself there would be time to reconnect, to catch up. But now she knew time could be taken without warning. That evening, over tea, Lydia asked me, "Do these things always come with signs?" I told her the truth, that sometimes strokes arrive without warning, but often the body gives clues. Weakness in one side, changes in speech, sudden vision trouble, or even a fleeting numbness, things that are easy to ignore in a busy life. If you notice something strange, even if it goes away in minutes, I said, treat it as a gift. It's your body whispering to you. Lydia didn't reply right away. She simply stirred her tea, the spoon making slow circles. Finally, she nodded, more to herself than to me. "I think I've been ignoring whispers for years," she said. From that day forward, she began a small ritual. Each morning, she would sit quietly by the window for 5 minutes, simply paying attention to how her body felt. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the first shift, an awareness that listening might be the most powerful thing she could do for herself. The first time Lydia went for a walk after her hospital stay, she felt like she was stepping into a different neighborhood, even though it was the same tree-lined street she'd lived on for 30 years. She noticed the cracks in the sidewalk, the uneven cobblestones near the bakery, the way the wind funneled down the narrow lane. She'd always walked quickly, with a sense of purpose, but now each step felt deliberate, almost cautious. It wasn't fear, it was a new kind of awareness, like she was trying to memorize the world beneath her feet. Her friend Margaret joined her that morning, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Margaret was a talker, filling the air with stories about her grandkids, her garden, the latest neighborhood gossip. But halfway through their walk, she slowed her pace and glanced sideways. "You're walking differently," she said. Lydia smiled faintly. "I'm walking like I plan to keep walking for a long time." Margaret laughed, but it wasn't a dismissive laugh, more of a relieved one, as if she understood. A few days earlier, her doctor had explained that regular movement, simple things like walking, was one of the most effective ways to reduce the risk of another stroke. It kept the blood flowing, strengthened the heart, and, perhaps most importantly, gave her a reason to get outside and breathe. Lydia liked that part best. She didn't think of it as exercise. She thought of it as claiming her mornings. Still, there were moments when her body reminded her that it had been through something. Once, while bending to tie her shoe, she felt a slight wave of dizziness. It passed in seconds, but she sat on a bench and waited for her breath to steady. She didn't brush it off like she might have before. Instead, she told Margaret about it, and they sat together for a while, sipping coffee, watching the leaves shift in the breeze. In the weeks that followed, Lydia's walks became a kind of moving meditation. She began noticing the way her feet pressed into the ground, how her arms swung gently at her sides, the rhythm of her breathing. She took shorter steps on days she felt tired, longer strides when her energy returned. She learned that her body's needs changed from day to day, and she respected those shifts instead of pushing through them blindly. One morning, as we sat in her kitchen, Lydia told me something that stayed with me. "I used to think walking was just getting from one place to another," she said. "Now it's like checking in with myself." She sipped her tea and smiled. "I think that's what kept me safe the other day, not just moving, but noticing how I was moving." It was a small transformation, but a deep one. She wasn't just avoiding danger, she was building a quieter, steadier kind of strength, step by step. And in that slow, deliberate pace, she was also finding something she hadn't expected, a sense of trust in her own body again. It started one rainy afternoon when Lydia was flipping through an old cookbook, the kind with handwritten notes tucked between the pages. She had always loved cooking, but in recent years her meals had grown smaller, simpler, often just toast, tea, and whatever was easy. But after her doctor gently explained that certain foods could help keep her blood vessels healthy, she began to see her kitchen differently. It wasn't just a place to make meals, it was a place where she could protect her future. Claire had been the one to suggest they cook together once a week. On their first cooking day, she arrived with a basket full of fresh vegetables, olive oil, and salmon. They laughed as they worked side by side, Lydia chopping garlic while Claire sliced peppers. Lydia had always known that good food mattered, but hearing her doctor talk about omega-3 fatty acids for brain health made her pay closer attention. Salmon, walnuts, flaxseed, these were no longer just ingredients. They were small promises to herself. Still, Lydia refused to turn eating into a chore. She didn't want a list of forbidden foods or a diet that felt like punishment. Instead, she started thinking of her plate as a canvas, painting it with color. Deep greens from spinach, bright reds from tomatoes, golden yellows from roasted squash. She liked the way it made her feel, not just physically, but emotionally. The act of preparing these meals gave her a sense of agency, a quiet rebellion against the uncertainty she had felt that day at the hospital. One evening, she invited Margaret over for dinner. They sat at the small round table by the window, the scent of roasted vegetables filling the room. "This is the best I've eaten in months," Margaret said between bites. Lydia smiled, pleased not only with the compliment, but with the fact that she could share something that made her feel stronger. It wasn't about being perfect. There were still days when she reached for biscuits with her tea, but the balance was shifting. The more Lydia cooked, the more she realized that food wasn't just fuel, it was connection. Each meal carried a memory. The apple pie her mother used to bake, the lentil soup she made for her students on cold winter days, the tea she shared with friends after long walks. Eating well wasn't about avoiding illness alone, it was about living in a way that honored both her past and her future. By the time spring arrived, Lydia's kitchen shelves looked different. There were jars of nuts, bottles of extra virgin olive oil, a basket of fresh fruit that she refilled each week. And when she looked at them, she didn't just see groceries. She saw a kind of quiet preparation, a daily act of choosing health without making it the only thing in her life. It was a Sunday afternoon when Lydia first noticed it. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, standing in the hallway with a puzzled look, searching for the right word mid-sentence. Lydia had seen it before in her own reflection, on that morning when her pen slipped and her words stumbled. She felt a quiet pang in her chest. Later, over tea with me, she admitted that she had started paying closer attention, not just to her own speech, but to the rhythm and clarity in others. One of the strangest parts of her own warning stroke had been that her thoughts felt clear, yet the words in her mouth seemed to slow down, as though stuck in honey. The hospital neurologist had told her that sudden difficulty speaking or understanding speech was one of the most important signals to act on immediately. Even if it lasts only a minute, he had said, that minute could mean everything. Lydia kept that sentence tucked in her mind like a note folded into her pocket. After that, conversations took on a new texture for her. She noticed pauses, hesitations, shifts in tone. It wasn't about suspicion, it was about connection. She started calling her old friends more often, lingering on the phone, letting their voices fill the quiet corners of her apartment. Sometimes she caught herself listening as if she could hear health itself in the way a person spoke. One rainy evening, her daughter called to say she was feeling a bit funny, her tongue heavy after a stressful day. The old Lydia might have told her to rest and see how she felt in the morning, but this Lydia's voice was steady and firm. "Claire, I want you to go to the ER. Now." It turned out to be nothing serious, just exhaustion, but Claire later admitted that hearing the urgency in her mother's voice had unsettled her, in a good way. "You sounded like you knew something I didn't," she said. Lydia just smiled. She did. This new attentiveness wasn't just about strokes, it was about presence. She was learning to really hear the people she loved in all their subtle changes, and in doing so, she realized she was also listening to herself more deeply. Words mattered, yes, but so did the silences between them, the sigh before answering, the warmth or coolness in a reply. It was a kind of listening that had nothing to do with being a doctor or a patient. It was the kind of listening that kept her human. That spring, Lydia wrote in her journal, "I used to think listening was passive. Now I know it's a way of caring." And with each conversation, she quietly practiced it, turning awareness into a habit she would never again take for granted. It was early morning when Lydia first noticed it. She had just stepped out of the shower, steam curling across the bathroom mirror when her reflection caught her off guard. Something in her smile felt uneven, not dramatic, not the drooping face from the posters in the clinic waiting room, just a faint, almost imperceptible difference between one side and the other. For a second, she thought she was imagining it. She tilted her head, tried again, and the smile looked normal, but the feeling lingered. She remembered the nurse in the hospital telling her that facial asymmetry could be one of the first visible signs of a stroke. "Even if it's subtle, don't second guess it," the nurse had said. "Check yourself and check the clock." That advice had stayed with her like a tune she couldn't shake. So instead of brushing it off, Lydia did something she'd never done before. She picked up her phone and took a photo of her own smile. Side by side with an older picture, it looked the same. Relief washed over her, but so did a quiet satisfaction. She had noticed. From that day on, the mirror became more than just a place to comb her hair or straighten her collar. It became a checkpoint, not an obsession. Lydia refused to live in fear, but a gentle habit. Each morning, she'd greet her reflection with a small smile, raise her eyebrows, and give her cheeks a playful puff of air. It made her laugh sometimes, and that too felt like medicine. Claire teased her about it when she found out. "So now you're doing daily face exercises?" she joked, but she understood. They both knew that early detection wasn't about paranoia. It was about stacking the odds in your favor. And Lydia found a kind of empowerment in knowing she could read her own body in the simplest ways without machines or tests. One afternoon, Margaret dropped by unexpectedly, her face flushed from climbing the stairs. Lydia invited her in for tea, and as they chatted, she caught herself watching Margaret smile, her eyes, the way she held her cup. She didn't say anything, there was nothing wrong, but the act of noticing had become second nature, like looking both ways before crossing the street. In the quiet hours before bed, Lydia sometimes thought about how much had changed since that day at the kitchen table. She wasn't living in constant alarm, but she was living awake. The mirror had taught her something unexpected, that vigilance could be gentle, even loving. Watching herself closely wasn't about fear of what might happen, it was about gratitude that she was here to keep watching. And every time she saw her reflection smiling back, she felt a small but certain truth settle inside her. She was ready to face whatever came next, one clear-eyed morning at a time. By the time summer came, Lydia had grown comfortable in her new rhythms, morning walks, colorful meals, quiet moments by the window, small mirror check-ins. They were woven into her days without effort, but one thing kept tugging at her, the thought of others who might not recognize the same whispers she had learned to hear. It started with a conversation in the park. She was sitting on a bench when a young mother sat down beside her, a toddler wobbling in front of them. They exchanged small talk, and somewhere in the conversation, the woman mentioned her father's recent funny spell, where he couldn't grip his coffee mug for a few minutes. Lydia felt that familiar weight in her chest. She leaned in slightly and, in her gentle, teacherly way, told the woman what she wished someone had told her years ago. "Don't wait for it to happen again. Even if it passes, it's worth checking." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes clouding with thought. That evening, Lydia called Claire. "I think I want to start telling people," she said. "Not lecturing, just sharing, like we're passing along a family recipe, except the recipe is for keeping someone alive." Claire smiled at the idea, and within a week, Lydia was speaking casually to friends at her book club, to the man who ran the corner store, even to her hairdresser. She never used medical jargon, she told stories. She described that morning at the kitchen table, the pen slipping from her fingers, the weight in her leg, the odd warmth in her cheek. She shared the little habits she'd adopted, checking her smile, listening to her speech, paying attention to how her body moved. And every time she ended with the same thought: if something feels off, don't talk yourself out of it, just get checked. One day Margaret called her, voice trembling but steady. Her cousin had been at a family lunch when she suddenly dropped her fork and slurred a few words. Margaret remembered Lydia's words, called emergency services immediately, and her cousin was treated in time. "You saved her," Margaret said. Lydia shook her head. "No, You saved her. I just gave you the map. The truth was, Lydia's journey had been about more than avoiding another stroke. It had been about reclaiming her place in the world, not as someone fragile, but as someone attentive, present, and quietly strong. Her habits weren't rules, they were gifts she gave herself every day. And now they were gifts she could give to others without cost, without ceremony. Just a simple conversation over tea, a story shared in passing. On her 73rd birthday, she sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand, writing another letter to her granddaughter. The words flowed smoothly, the handwriting even and steady. She paused for a moment, looked out the window at the street below, and smiled. The sunlight touched the paper the same way it had that morning months ago, but everything else was different. This time she felt not the shadow of fear, but the quiet certainty that she was living awake, and that she would never again ignore the whispers. It was late autumn when Lydia decided to write something she had been thinking about for months, a letter not to one person, but to anyone who might need it. She began the way she always did, with a cup of tea and her favorite fountain pen, the one that had once slipped from her fingers on that fateful morning. The letter was simple. She told her story without embellishment, how the warning stroke had arrived like a whisper, not a thunderclap. She wrote about the little habits she had adopted, how they had quietly rebuilt her trust in her own body. And she wrote about the small moments that mattered, the first walk where she felt safe again, the shared meals that brought her closer to family, the conversations where she listened with a new kind of care. When she finished, she didn't sign it with "Love, Lydia," but with something she felt fit better, from someone who knows what it means to get a second chance. She gave copies to Claire, to Margaret, to her book club friends. She left one at the corner cafe with a note inviting anyone to take it. 2 weeks later, she received a call from a man she didn't know. His sister had picked up her letter at the cafe, read it aloud at a family gathering, and as a result, they had recognized the early signs in their mother the very next day. She had been treated quickly and was recovering well. "You don't know us," the man said, "but you've changed our lives." Lydia sat in silence for a moment, her hand over her mouth, feeling a wave of gratitude that almost brought her to tears. From then on, she kept a small stack of letters in her handbag, folded neatly in envelopes. She didn't hand them out to everyone, just when the moment felt right, when a conversation drifted toward health, aging, or funny spells that were too easily dismissed. Each time she gave one away, she felt like she was passing on a piece of her own survival, something far more valuable than advice, a reminder that listening to your body is not an act of fear, but of love. That winter, as the first snow fell, Lydia sat again at her kitchen table. The light was soft, the air quiet except for the faint hum of her heater. She wrote another letter, this one to her granddaughter. She told her that life will always whisper before it shouts, and the real art is learning when to stop, listen, and respond. She sealed the envelope, placed it in the post, and smiled to herself, knowing that sometimes the smallest words travel the farthest. Spring returned slowly, unfolding in soft greens outside Lydia's window. By then, it had been more than a year since the morning that changed her life. There were no grand anniversaries marked on her calendar, no parties, no speeches, just the quiet acknowledgement that she had lived another year fully awake. Claire suggested they celebrate anyway, not with a big dinner, but with something simple, an afternoon in the park where they used to walk when Claire was a child. Margaret came too, carrying a basket of sandwiches and fruit. They spread a blanket under a blooming cherry tree, the petals drifting down like slow confetti. As they ate, they spoke of ordinary things, the price of vegetables at the market, the stubborn creak in Margaret's front door, Claire's plans for the summer. Yet beneath the conversation ran a silent current of gratitude. They all knew they might not have been here together if Lydia had ignored those first strange signs. At one point, Claire handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver locket, engraved with the words, "Always listen." Lydia traced the letters with her fingertips, her throat tightening. She realized the gift wasn't just about health. It was about how deeply her family had absorbed her lesson, how they had begun to live it themselves. Later, as the sun dipped low, Lydia leaned back on the blanket and closed her eyes. The breeze carried the scent of blossoms, the distant laughter of children, the gentle hum of life moving on. She thought of all the small shifts she had made, the walks, the meals, the conversations, the mirror checks, the letters. None of them felt heavy or forced anymore. They were simply the way she lived. She opened her eyes to see Claire and Margaret talking softly, their heads tilted toward each other, and felt a quiet joy settle in her chest. This, she realized, was the real celebration, not surviving that one morning, but building a life where she and the people she loved were more present, more connected, more willing to act when it mattered. As they packed up the picnic and began walking home, Lydia glanced at the path ahead. The evening light stretched long across the grass, and she stepped into it without hurry, each footfall steady and sure. The day would end, as all days do, but she knew, deep in her bones, that she would meet tomorrow with the same care, the same awareness, and the same gratitude that had carried her here. By midsummer, Lydia had begun spending more time in the community garden a few blocks from her apartment. She had never been much of a gardener before. She liked flowers, but she'd always said her thumbs were more tea-stained than green. Yet the idea of planting something and watching it grow felt different now, almost symbolic. One warm morning, she claimed a small patch of soil, no bigger than a kitchen table. She decided to fill it with herbs, basil, rosemary, thyme, and bright marigolds to keep the insects away. Margaret joined her, bringing a tray of seedlings and an old watering can that had belonged to her mother. As they knelt in the dirt, Lydia realized she hadn't felt this grounded, literally and figuratively, in years. The other gardeners began to notice her visits. They stopped by to chat, sometimes to ask advice, sometimes just to share a story. And without intending to, Lydia found herself telling her own, about the day her pen slipped, the hospital visit, the small daily choices that had become her lifeline. It never felt like a lecture. She simply spoke the way you might tell someone about the weather or a favorite recipe, quietly, warmly, without pressure. One afternoon, a man named Daniel, who tended the plot next to hers, told her that after hearing her story, he'd convinced his father to get checked for sudden dizziness that had been brushed off as just age. The test showed a small blockage, caught early enough to treat. Daniel's voice cracked when he thanked her. Lydia just smiled and pressed a marigold into his hand, saying, "Plant this for me." Over time, her little herb patch became more than a garden. It became a meeting place, a spot where neighbors lingered, where stories were traded as easily as sprigs of rosemary. Lydia loved the way the plants responded to care, how they leaned toward the sun, how their fragrance deepened after rain. It reminded her of the human heart, how it too could grow stronger and more generous when tended to each day. As autumn approached, she harvested her herbs, drying them in neat bundles by the kitchen window. She set aside jars for Claire, for Margaret, for the young mother she'd met in the park months earlier. With each jar, she included a small note. A little flavor for your table, and a little reminder to listen to yourself. The garden might sleep through the winter, but Lydia knew she'd be back in the spring. She had planted more than herbs there. She had planted the habit of sharing, the quiet kind that slips into people's lives and stays there, unseen but enduring. And that, she thought, might be the truest form of health she could give. Winter had settled in, wrapping the city in a quiet stillness. Lydia's apartment was warm, filled with the scent of rosemary from the bundles she had hung to dry months earlier. The days were shorter now, but she found a certain comfort in the early evenings, when the lamplight softened the corners of her living room and the world outside felt hushed. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the same place where, over a year ago, her pen had slipped from her fingers. This time, her handwriting was steady as she began the last page of a letter she had been writing for weeks. It was addressed not to one person, but to whoever finds it. In it, she spoke about the value of noticing, the subtle changes, the whispers the body sends before it shouts. She wrote about the small acts that had kept her well, the walks, the meals, the moments of listening, the mirror checks, the garden. She didn't write as a teacher or even as a survivor, but as a fellow traveler. Her words carried no instructions, only invitations. Pause when you feel something is off. Share your story before it's too late. Treat every ordinary day like it's rare. When she finished, she set down the pen and read the letter aloud to herself. There was no rush in her voice, no urgency, just a calm certainty that these words might reach someone at exactly the right time. She folded the pages neatly, slipped them into an envelope, and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most treasured things. She would leave it somewhere it could be found when she no longer could explain it in person. Later that night, Lydia stood by the window, watching snow fall under the glow of the street lamps. Each flake landed quietly, building something unseen but lasting, just like the habits, the conversations, the seeds she had planted over the past year. She thought of all the people she had met, all the lives that might have been changed in small but important ways, and she felt the warmth of it spread through her. When she turned away from the window, she glanced at the table, at the letter waiting there. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was holding on to a warning. She felt like she was passing on a gift. And that, she realized, was the ending she had been writing all along. Over the course of a single year, Lydia's life shifted in ways she never imagined. What began as a frightening morning at her kitchen table, a pen slipping from her fingers, a heaviness in her leg, became the quiet catalyst for a new way of living. She learned to listen to her body with patience instead of doubt, to move through each day with an awareness that felt less like fear and more like care. Her transformations weren't loud or dramatic. They lived in small, deliberate acts, the morning walks taken at her own pace, the meals prepared with color and intention, the habit of checking her smile in the mirror, the way she listened closely to the voices of those she loved. Each choice was a gentle investment in her future, a way of keeping herself present not just for her own sake, but for the people who mattered most. Lydia's story reminds us that health is rarely rebuilt in grand gestures. More often, it's in the whispers we heed, the dizziness we don't ignore, the words that feel slower than they should, the tiny changes we choose to notice. These are not just warnings, they are invitations to act, to protect the days we still have ahead. If there's one truth to carry from her journey, it's this: your body is always speaking, whether in a fleeting weakness, a subtle shift in balance, or a feeling you can't quite name. Those messages are worth your attention. Listening doesn't take much time, but it can give you more time than you ever expect. So pause, notice, and respond. Let Lydia's second chance be the reminder that your own chance is here, now, in this very moment. And may you meet it with the same quiet courage that carried her forward.